It can be spectacular by positive action, but it can be spectacular also in the sense of a tragic confrontation in which you become, as it were, the very symbol of all the things which the revolution was trying to redeem, and transform. If you are looking at the point of redemption in the solar chart, it comes at the cusp of the 8th house. It's not marked there, and of course there you have the symbol of the 8th house, the whole idea of regeneration, which is also the symbol of the fruits. The 8th house is the fruits of partnerships. Everything that a culture has provided, which all is based on certain type of relationship. So all that is more or less focalized into the 8th house. I might say passingly there that the 8th house is, especially for us today, the house of business. It is very interesting that in astrology, in a society at a time where everything is business, there is no house which really deals with business in ordinary type of astrology. Certainly the 2nd house doesn't deal with business. It deals with what you own, what you have, what you find yourself born with, or the things that you acquire in a certain sense. But that is not business. Business represents the immense web of relationship which link consumer and producer and distributor and everybody as member of a society. This is business. And everything of business deal with the relationship between every one of the components of that society in different role. It's a great ritual. The 8th house deals also with rituals because it deals with the organization of relationship. 7th house, relationship. 8th house, the organization of relationship. And the fruit, and therefore the fructifying of relationship. You see. It is in a certain sense regeneration because generation occurred more in the 2nd house because it deals more with what you own as a generic factor, as part of a family, as part of a culture, and all that. You are born with that. It is your potential is there, you see. And you can actualize that potential or not, and if you do it in a later 2nd cycle of your life, then you may become rich, you may gain money, and so on like that. But the real business, which is not related to a particular individual, but related to the fruit of is being related to any other individual, which is business in the deepest sense of the term, and that is the 8th house. Now, you see that point of redemption there at the cusp of that 8th house is a very beautiful, significant things, because that was the things that the revolution was trying to accomplish, a complete upheaval of all social relationship, all business relationship, but all relationship with interpersonal and intergroup and interclass relationships and so on. And there he was, point of redemption. That is the things that he had to deal with. That was the ghost of the past. Well, all that he could do, apparently, was to become its victim, you see, to become an expiatory lamb, as it were, for the crime and the tragedy of his past. The interesting thing there is that Lenin, who was, of course, his main opponent, head of the revolution, had a Saturn exactly on that same, well, not exactly the same, but 26.5 degrees of Sagittarius. So Lenin's Saturn was on the Tsar point of redemption. Trotsky, who was with Lenin, one of the architects of the revolution, and as the head of the Red Army saved Russia from foreign countries and all that, had his conjunction of Mars and Pluto very close to the Tsar sun, natal sun. His Saturn was conjunction to the Tsar moon, and his Uranus was conjunction to the Tsar ascendant. Now, if that is not a very interesting and significant relationship, I don't know what on earth should be. You see. Now, to come to a more recent things, which perhaps has a certain vague relation to it, taking the chart of Nixon. He had the sun in Capricorn, 1928, the moon in Aquarius, 2005, ascendant in Virgo, 1345, and it gives a point of redemption in Gemini at 2548. Now, this falls in Nixon's 10th house. And Pluto is at 2830 retrograde in that 10th house. So in a certain sense, though it is not terribly close, but nevertheless it's close enough to be relatively significant. And also to deal with to show what kind of redemption or what kind of problem there, which is the problem of that Gemini things, which, by the way, was of course very close also to the Mars of the United States in the 7th house, which was at 2122 Gemini. If, on the other hand, you are putting that point of redemption in Nixon's chart in his solar chart, then it falls in the 6th solar house, which is the house of personal crisis. And the 6th house is the house in which you are facing the result of too much 5th house used in the wrong way. You have expressed yourself so much without paying attention to anybody else that you realize that anybody else around you are resisting and kicking you back. And you have to retrain yourself if you want to live, or you get sick, or whatever it is that you have to deal with through some kind of a personal crisis. The 12th house, in the other hand, is the house of social crisis, where you are involved in the crisis of your culture, of your society as a whole. Now, I think to some extent, now I don't know how anybody feel about Nixon, and I'm certainly not a fan of Nixon by far from that, but nevertheless, it is a very interesting thing, and you can certainly say that in a way, because of many things that happened, that tape business and all that, he acted as if something in him was taking upon himself consciously or unconsciously to exemplify what everybody else was really doing also. Not in his position, of course, but what was in the collective mentality of his culture, of his society, ambition, domineering, and crudeness and vulgarity and God knows what, and at the same time a great deal of managerial ability to some extent and all those things like that. You can say in a certain sense, therefore, that he took upon himself the collective sin of his nation in order to bring it out, to make it very obvious that really that was what was happening in America, you see. And in a certain sense, took upon himself to expiate for the sin of the politicians who, most of whom, or a great many of whom, in his position might have done pretty close to what he did, perhaps more intelligently, but nevertheless, you know. So that it is always a very interesting thing, and sometimes if you are dealing with those aspects and those points, or part of fortune, point of spirit, part of spirit, point of redemption, and so on, you are dealing with very subtle matter. For one thing, you can only use them effectively if you know only the exact time of birth. If the ascendant is not right more than 2 or 3 degrees, I mean, it's no good. You might as well forget about it, you see. The part of fortune has a certain value if you are not sure at all of what the time you were born. It can tell you at least it remain in that same house during the day or a number of hours in which you were born, so that you have a certain, if you don't know the ascendant, you might know at any rate the house in which the part of fortune was placed, and in that sense it can be relatively valuable. But otherwise, of course, it all depends on the exact position of the ascendant.
I'm just curious, you said before, like the moon representing the past and the ascendant the future. What if somebody has the moon in the past and the same time as the ascendant?
Well,
Is that indicative of something really positive about how the past, what you bring with you, can really help actualize your present potential?
well, in a certain sense, I would say in that case that the problem of dealing with the past, dealing with the moon, is an experience through which you will realize who you are as an individual, you see. In other words, it is in a way your karma. Sometimes in some chart, I don't say it is the chart that you mentioned, but in some case it means a strong influence of the mother or mother complex. It means psychic influence of various kind. But all those things deal really with the past, you see. Now, the fact that it is in the first house means that all those problems related to the past have a very urgent meaning, intense meaning in your own personal, individual life. And therefore, that you have to deal with them and use them as opportunity to find who you are, you see. In other words, it give more urgency or intensity or to the problem of dealing with that past and using it as an opportunity to find who really you are. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I just questioned why does it always have to be a problem?
Why it has to be a problem?
Yeah.
I don't use the term problem in the sense of a disastrous thing or something terrible. In a certain sense, anything is a problem in the sense that it presents to you the opportunity to take either a positive or a negative approach to it. You can have a very wonderful relationship to your mother, let us say, suppose that it is something to do with it. Maybe a wonderful mother, and you have been very happy there. But that happiness and that wonderfulness of your mother, or a mother, may be the most binding factor in yourself, in your personal life, you see. So that it doesn't need to be a harsh or difficult thing. you are more bound to the past by a kind of binding attachment that by experience which have forced you to rebel against it to some extent. Except that when you rebel violently against something, you still remain very much attached to it just by that rebellion, you know. So you are as bound to the thing that you hate as to the things that you adore. I think the only freedom comes from detachment, from being completely objective to it. Any other questions? Yeah, in the back here.
Repeat the question to the microphone.
Yeah, because sometimes, yeah.
If the part of spirit is kind of a counterpoint to the part of fortune, is there something that is similar in relation to the part of redemption? In other words, if you would subtract the distance from the sun, you know, that the moon is from the ascendant instead of adding it?
You get the part of the point of, you get the part of spirit.
I thought this part of spirit had to do with is the counterpoint to the part of fortune.
Yeah, but you get the same point.
Oh, you will.
You see, it's an interesting fact because you have three factors, and you can work them out in so many ways, but not too many ways, you know. And you see, what you are doing with the part of spirit, or any of those retrograde parts, is you are dealing with the process of what I call interiorization. There are the parts which are direct part. The part of fortune is a direct part, you see. It's exteriorization. It moves in the direction of the natural order of the sign. Anything which is converse, which move in opposition to it, retrograde in the zodiac, you see, deal with a process of interiorization. In the part of fortune, you are exteriorizing, as it were, the relationship between the sun and the moon. Therefore, it is sometimes called the point of happiness, of good fortune, of wealth, and so on. Because what you are doing there is it can be, does not always mean, but it can mean a exteriorization, you see, of that energy of life, of that solely lunar kind of life energy. And for instance, one thing that I have found quite characteristic, in my book, The Lunation Cycle, you will find all the things about the part of fortune in relation in the different houses and in conjunction to the different planets and so on. If you have the part of fortune in conjunction to Jupiter, or the part of fortune in conjunction to Saturn, it's a very characteristic thing. The people who have the part of fortune in conjunction Jupiter have almost always a more expansive, sometimes expensive, approach to life. They radiate, they go out more socially, not necessarily extroverted, but it can very often be a sign of extroversion. Whereas the people who have Saturn in conjunct the part of fortune, well, depending on who they are, what level of consciousness they are, they can be very depressed, very pessimistic, or else they can be so intent on going to the root of things, to the depths of things, which of course doesn't make one optimistic usually. You know. But that is other very characteristic things, and I suppose you can to some extent have that when you have it conjunct Venus or Mars and so on. Whereas in the case of the part of spirit, what you are dealing there is basically a return to source, a return to the past. I don't know, how many people here have used converse progressions in astrology? Well, quite a few, but not too many. Well, I think converse progression, again, are usually very badly misunderstood to my mind, or at least they have given more meaning than sometimes they should have been given. A converse progression, again, is a return to the source. You return to the for the prenatal condition. You are returning to if you have strong aspect there, they are usually very definitely karmic aspects. There are things that you cannot do hardly anything about. You have very little free will or free choice about it. There are matters which are very structurally inbuilt, inbred, you might say, in your personality. But therefore, they can be very significant. But nevertheless, if you are a strong person, a strong individual, and depending how they balance with direct progression, you can be able to definitely redeem them, as it were. I mean, neutralize the karmic past, and by going through it, like I said 2 days ago, the only way you can fulfill your dharma is to go through your karma, not to escape from it, not to try to make it less strong or to try to play trick with it, but to face it, realizing that it is an opportunity to meet the past and through that to grow and expand, you see, and become yourself. So anything which deal with retrograde motion and so on, to some extent, is an interiorization process. It gives you, as it were, a second chance to deal with the situation and to tell you, well, look, could have been done much better, or you certainly failed to do the things that you were supposed to do. I think I mentioned, again, Friday, the fact that sins of omissions are far more important in many cases than sins of commission, because a sin of commission may bring some bad result through which you may learn what is true, but a sin of omission, you're not aware of it, or you refuse to recognize it very easily because you dismiss it, you know. You don't realize that you might have done something else, or if you do, you feel, oh well, you know, that's nothing I could do about it. And yet they are the things which altogether constitute the unfinished business of your life. And that unfinished business has to be met in some future life. And that applies even to certain cycle, a 7-year cycle. The unfinished business of a 7-year cycle may have to be met in the next 7-year cycle, you see. Or the unfinished business of the first part of your life before 35 or 42 may have to be met into the latter part of your life. And sometimes life is a very interesting thing. It's like a hinge, and you have two things like that, and this there reflect to this there, and this there reflect to that, you know. So that you meet, if you count the 42 year as the midpoint of life, what you say 22 years late, what you have done at 20 this would be 22 years before. You see, you may have to meet when you are 64, 22 years later. At least you have the chance of meeting it, and therefore getting rid of it, neutralizing it. And if you can die having neutralized all your karma, which is more than most anybody can do, but at least as far as this particular existence is concerned, then you are relatively free. You have no unfinished business. That's one of the reasons why when I go to bed, I'm always want as much as possible to have the things ready for the next morning, and as much the thing cleaned up and fixed up, so that the thing is done. Of course, you cannot do that in most cases because things go on from day to day and day to day. But there is a tendency to some people to leave, oh, I'll do it tomorrow morning, you know. The point is to try to finish a cycle with as little unfinished business as possible. So I don't know what we were talking about. Oh, yes. Well, the interesting thing, you see, is that therefore in the point of spirit, a part of spirit, you are, as it were, going toward the past. Some people interpret it as going to the ancestors, to the root. I mean, go back to your roots, and if you have strayed away or lost yourself in all sorts of centrifugal experience and activities, to go back to that which is really the roots of your being, you see. Well, in a certain sense, it is. You can relate it also to that the polar complement of the point of redemption is also something like that. I mean, you try to find out why the things need to be redeemed, you see. What are the cause of the things? What led to that, and what is involved in the possibility and the opportunity for redemption. But those are things, you see, which are very subtle and which, of course, you cannot deal with when you are dealing with somebody who comes for an interview for an hour or so, whom perhaps you have never met before and will never meet before and want to know all about his or her life, you know. So that in a certain sense it's rather unfortunate that astrological practice is done in such a way. I mean, astrology doesn't offer a panacea in any way or shape at the psychological level. It helps you simply to have a frame of reference, a structure of activity, a structure of being, you might say even more, against the background of which you can then understand the experience of that person who is in front of you and tell you this and this happened to me and what should I do with that or that, you see. It doesn't tell you anything precise in terms of event or in terms of things to do and all that. But it locates the things, it frames it, it gives you the possibility, you have something abstract, a blueprint or something which helps you to structure the situation. And that's, of course, the value of the kind of astrology that I have promoted, and perhaps more than anybody else, astrology which deal with cycle, with processes. Because if you can look at any situation, any circumstance, any event as only a phase of a process, which has a beginning and has potential end and culmination and so on, then you are looking at it objectively, and you can meet it not as a separate event which just happened and why did it happen to me, you know, I'm so good and so on. But to see, you see, how the thing is linked with everything else in your life, and an expression of the totality of your particular personality. And seeing it from that point of view, then it gives a completely different light and dimension to that event. As I have said and repeated so many times, I mean, one of the most valuable things in astrology is that it transforms separate events into phases of processes, so that nothing is separate. Everything is related in your life, and of course in the life of your surrounding and humanity as a whole. Everything is related, and you want to try to understand the rhythm of those relatedness, of those tidal flow of event and development and unfoldments. And that's why such a thing as the part of fortune and such matters are important, because they help you to focus in a relatively single point processes which involve at least two factors, and involve really three factors, because it involves you as a person who are dealing with those two factors, you see. And that is really what I mean by humanistic astrology. Most people who use the term humanistic astrologer and humanistic school of astrology and all that very often have very little understanding of what it all is about. Because it's not merely to be a little more psychological than people who tell about fortune telling and so on. That's not the point. I mean, that's not the whole point. The whole point is the attitude that you take toward the person, toward life, toward events in the life. It is the quality of your living that counts. It's not what you do. Spiritual life can be just exactly the same kind of life that somebody else is living next door. But the quality of that living may be totally different. And that's why it is difficult, it is subtle, and why it is so hard to just look at a chart and somebody say, here's my chart, tell me. It's nonsense. The point what you want to is you are dealing with a human being who is there in front of you, or yourself if you are your own chart, it's the mirror, and what is it all about? Do you understand your life? I mean, do you understand why these things have happened? What is happening now? What meaning do you give it? How are you going to meet this if you are going to meet certain thing that you think is coming ahead of you? When I used to do lots of charts, not lots of charts, I never did so much, but I did a few. And people sometimes would come and said, I met that young man or young woman, and do you think I should marry? And that was the time before synastry was popular, where you didn't speak about composite chart or all that strange business. Maybe I'm going to get married. Do you think I should get married to that person? And I said, only reaction I could have, what do you want to marry for? I mean, what is your idea of marriage? Now, if somebody asks there and I see that in the chart there is a very so-called afflicted or tense seventh house or whatever it is, or that just now there are some certain progression which shows rather difficult tense situation and things like that. And if you say that person said, what do you want to marry? Oh, well, I think it will be such a wonderful father for my children, and I'm quite sure we could live very happy in a suburban home, have two cars in our garage and all those kind of things like that. And all what you can say is, well, that's a fine idea, but I don't know if it is the proper time for it to work it out. You see, that doesn't mean that you should marry that man, but if you expect that, it's probably not exactly the kind of thing that you will have to meet. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. Perhaps you need to let go of those nice ideal dreams, and face reality. But are you willing to face reality? And do you think that you will love that person enough, or whatever it is, or so on and so forth, so that you can meet the situation? That's all you can say, Because do you see that event in relation to a general process of human and personal development? And that's the only thing that counts. Prediction is absolutely useless in most cases, because what happens is that you either expect wonderful things and then you relax your guards and all that, and you may miss the opportunity, or you are facing something which you are told is very difficult, and you are so frightened about it that it makes it worse and worse. The only thing that you can do significantly is to try to understand at what phase of a cycle you are at the present time. For instance, in terms of so-called progress-lunation cycle or other cycle of transits and so on. And to try to tell the person, well, this is perhaps more the end of a cycle than the beginning of the things. Perhaps before you start that new business that you want or that new relationship, perhaps there is something that has to be brought to a culmination or to a conclusion before you can really start there. Are you sure that it is the things that you will build from 2-3 years from now or a year from now? Of course, it might be a way toward that, but the main, most important thing is the period that is starting, let's say, a year or two from now. You don't tell them what the sea is because you don't know it yourself. You can make all sorts of wild guesses, and sometimes, if you are lucky, of course, you can score a hit. But and of course, human nature is relatively very unoriginal, and so that under certain conditions, people are likely to do very much the thing that are expected of human beings under those conditions. But the more individualized you are, and the more you live in an individualized society, the more the chances of not normal or average kind of events taking place. But again, the important thing is not what takes place, is how you meet it. One more question, yeah?
You speak of the ascendant as potential which one has to actualize the future. And usually I've read of other astrologers speaking of the sun and that which orients one to the future.
Well, you can read all sorts of things from astrologers, You have. I don't see the logic of it. For one thing, it is to me absolutely obvious that if you are dealing with something which represents the most individual factor in your life, it should be the most fleeting and the most mysterious of all possible factors, because your individuality is very relatively unique, and so that if you are dealing with the sun, everybody has the sun in the same degree for 24 hours. There are so many people who would have the same destiny and all that. And after all, what is the sun? The sun is the source of power. Now, power is very important, of course. It's the foundation of everything. If you have a car without no engine at all or no source of power, to burn in that engine. Well, you wouldn't go anywhere, even if you have the most beautiful Rolls-Royce interior, you see. But nevertheless, what matters is not the power, only the driver. The sun gives you the kind of power that you are using. You are born at a certain time of the year, at a certain month, with the sun in a certain sign, which means that one of the 12 basic type of differentiated energies is more likely to be used by you, is more basic to your nature, and therefore you are tending to use it the most frequently, and particularly whenever you deal with very serious confrontation, you immediately will use that kind of power. That is what the suns tell you. And of course it's the foundation on which all your personality is based. It's the source, the power within you. If you have no power, there is no you see. But it is quite different than to speak of the individual who is something transcendent, which is it is immanent also, but it is something which either is going to use that power or be completely choked by the power in some cases, or driven by the power, but especially, supposedly, will be the user of that power. And the question that you find at the ascendant is, why should I use that power? How should I use it? For, or rather, not how so much, but for what purpose? You see, and that is the Dharma, that is what am I born for? Okay, I have that wonderful Rolls-Royce, or I have that wonderful airplane and all that. Why have I? What am I supposed to do with it? This is where the individual situation comes in. And of course it is the most difficult thing to assess, because everything in your chart is involved in it. Everything in your relationship with other people, in your society, in your family, and all that is involved in it. So, but the astrologer, if he becomes familiar with all those other factors, having that basic frame of reference of the chart, can see where the things belong to, and to some extent, particularly in terms of progression and transit, can see at what phase of your life you are to use that power. And that's why progression, particularly the progress lunation cycle, 30-year cycle, and some of the big transit cycle like Uranus and Jupiter, Saturn and all that, are just as important as the natal chart. Because the important thing is, when you deal with a person, is what can I tell that person that will help that person to take a next step in his life? Well, it depends on its age, for one thing. There are certain things you can do at 14 or at 15 that you cannot do at 14. So the age factor in astrology is just as important as the natal factor. I have written that in several of my books, that the time of the consultation is just as important as the birth time, because it tells you to what extent you can talk to the person and what kind of language you can use in talking to that person. Or at least it can give you some inkling about it. I mean, it doesn't say everything, of course, obviously. But you see it in terms of the actual existential realities. There is nothing existential in a chart. It can be anything. It can be the chart of a cow, or a business firm, or a nation, or anything. It tells you nothing except abstract relationship. If you didn't know human nature, then you wouldn't be able to tell anything from the chart particularly, except that there is power, there is certain function there. If it is that particular organism use those functions in a certain way, that is the way it will be related to that other function and so on. But that's very abstract until you know that it is a human being, you see. Well, I thank you very much for your attention. Good night.
You have been listening to a talk given by Dane Rudhyar. For a catalogue of books and other taped lectures by Rudhyar, please write to the address on this cassette.